When I first moved into the neighborhood, I wanted nothing more than a quiet life away from the chaos of the city. The property was perfect, a stretch of land that backed up to a few newer houses, while still giving me enough space to enjoy privacy and peace. I had no interest in homeowners associations. I had seen how they operated, how they bullied residents into following absurd rules, and how they constantly tried to squeeze money out of people for fees and dues that never seemed to go toward anything meaningful. For months, everything went smoothly. I kept to myself, maintained my property, and enjoyed the land I had purchased fair and square. My garden thrived, and I often spent evenings sitting outside, watching the sunset dip below the horizon. But that peace didn't last long. Soon enough, the local HOA came knocking, insisting that I register my property under their control. At first, I thought it was some sort of mistake. My property wasn't part of their neighborhood. My deed clearly outlined that my land fell outside the boundaries of their HOA jurisdiction. Yet they acted as though my refusal to join was a violation of their rules. I dismissed them politely the first few times, assuming they would eventually realize they had no legal standing. But instead of going away, their persistence only grew stronger. Letters began to arrive in my mailbox. Harshly worded notices demanded that I pay hundreds of dollars in dues. They threatened fines, liens, and even legal action if I didn't comply. The letters carried the HOA's official letterhead, stamped with intimidating language that was clearly designed to scare people into submission. But I wasn't so easily intimidated. I knew my rights, and I knew they had no authority over me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was brewing. The HOA wasn't just being persistent. They were being aggressive, far more than any association should be over one property. I started noticing unfamiliar cars parked near my driveway, as though someone was watching my house. Neighbors I had never spoken to before began whispering as I walked by, their eyes filled with suspicion, as if I were some sort of troublemaker, simply because I refused to play by the HOA's rules. Then came the first truly bizarre encounter. One afternoon, I was outside tending to my garden when two men in uniforms walked up my driveway. They wore what appeared to be police attire, dark blue shirts, badges pinned to their chests, and utility belts strapped around their waists. At first glance, they looked official. But as they got closer, something seemed off. The uniforms didn't match those of the local police department I was familiar with, and the badges looked cheap, almost like something you would find in a costume shop. They approached me with authority, demanding to know why I hadn't complied with the HOA's orders. Their tone was sharp, commanding, as though they had the legal power to arrest me. They accused me of violating community laws and claimed they had been dispatched to enforce compliance. I stared at them in disbelief, realizing immediately what was happening. These weren't real police officers. They were imposters, hired by the HOA to intimidate me into submission. I played it cool in that moment, not giving them the reaction they were looking for. But inside, I was furious. The HOA had crossed a line. It was one thing to send letters and make threats on paper, but to send fake police officers to my property was something entirely different. It was fraud, it was harassment, and it was deeply illegal. That night, I pulled out my property documents again, combing through every line of the deed. I wanted to reassure myself that I was right, and I was. My land was outside their jurisdiction. But as I studied the map, something caught my eye. A boundary line stretched farther than I had initially realized. Not only was my house and land excluded from the HOA, but there was something even more shocking. The very office building the HOA operated out of, their so-called headquarters, was technically built on land that fell within my property line. I couldn't believe it. I read it again and again to be certain. My land extended beyond what I used day to day, and on that portion sat their building, their parking lot, everything. The HOA's entire office was sitting on land that legally belonged to me. It all started to make sense. Their desperation, their aggression, their fake enforcers, it was all connected. They weren't just trying to force me into their HOA for control or money. They were trying to cover up the fact that their entire operation was built on land they didn't even own. If I pressed the issue, their organization could collapse overnight. The realization filled me with both anger and a sense of power. They thought they could intimidate me into silence, but they had no idea I was sitting on the biggest weapon of all, the law itself. My ownership of the land meant everything they had built, everything they operated was hanging by a thread, and the harder they pushed against me, the closer they brought themselves to losing it all. From that moment forward, I knew this wasn't just about me refusing to join their HOA. This was about exposing them for what they truly were, frauds who had no rightful claim to the very ground they stood on. And so as the sun set on that night, I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't just fight back against their harassment. I would bring the entire corrupt operation down. The following days after the fake police incident were tense. I kept expecting them to return, this time more aggressive, more desperate. My nerves were on edge, but at the same time, I felt an undeniable determination rising within me. I knew I had leverage, more leverage than they realized. Still, I couldn't just rush in without preparation. The HOA had clearly shown they were willing to break the law to maintain their illusion of power. Sending fake police officers was no small stunt. That told me everything I needed to know about how far they were willing to go. They thrived on intimidation, fear, and silence. But I wasn't about to stay silent. The very next morning, I made a trip to the county records office. I needed official confirmation of what I already knew, proof that the HOA headquarters was, without a doubt, on my land. The clerk pulled out the property maps, marked with detailed boundary lines, and after a thorough check, there it was, plain as day. The shaded section representing my land stretched farther than I'd initially thought. Their entire office building and parking lot sat squarely on my property. The clerk glanced up at me with surprise. "Looks like you own more than you thought," he said casually. To him, it was just paperwork. To me, it was ammunition. Armed with certified copies of the documents, I felt a new surge of confidence. The HOA had played their hand recklessly, and now I was ready to play mine. But I wasn't foolish. If they were bold enough to impersonate law enforcement, then confronting them outright could be dangerous. I needed to be smart, strategic. That evening, I began documenting everything. The letters they sent, the fake cops that showed up, the conversations with neighbors who had been manipulated into turning against me. I stored the evidence in multiple places, making sure that even if something happened to me, the truth would come out. Sure enough, my suspicions about their next move came true. 3 days later, another car pulled into my driveway. This time, it wasn't men in fake uniforms. It was a sharply dressed woman carrying a briefcase who introduced herself as a compliance officer for the HOA. She spoke with a rehearsed politeness, masking the same intimidation tactics beneath a professional veneer. She claimed the HOA had voted to fine me thousands of dollars for non-compliance. She warned that if I didn't pay, the next step would be legal action and a lien placed against my property. She slid a thick envelope across my porch table, stuffed with paperwork designed to look like official court documents. But I wasn't fooled. I recognized the signs of forgery. The formatting was sloppy, the seals weren't authentic, and the signatures didn't match. They had crafted the illusion of legitimacy, banking on the fact that most people wouldn't question it, leaned back, calm but resolute. While she expected me to argue or panic, I simply told her I'd review it with my attorney. The truth was, I hadn't contacted one yet, but I planned to. Her reaction was telling. For the first time, I saw a flicker of unease in her eyes. They weren't expecting resistance. Later that night, I took a drive past the HOA office. It looked ordinary from the outside. Neatly painted walls, a trimmed lawn, a sign out front proclaiming it the center of community order. But as I parked at a distance and stared at it, all I could think about was the fact that it was mine. Legally, every brick, every window, every inch of asphalt in that parking lot belonged to me. That was the irony of it all. They were harassing me on my own property, threatening me with fake authority, while their entire empire was built on stolen land. The question that gnawed at me was, did they even know? Was the HOA leadership fully aware their office sat on my land, or had they convinced themselves otherwise over time? If they didn't know, then the shock of being exposed would be devastating. But if they did know, then their actions were even darker than I imagined. It would mean they were deliberately trying to silence me before I uncovered their secret. The next few days were quiet, almost too quiet. No fake cops, no new letters, no compliance officers knocking at my door. But I wasn't naive enough to believe they had backed down. This was just the calm before the storm. My suspicions were confirmed when I received a phone call late one night. The voice on the other end was deep, stern, and carefully controlled. They didn't identify themselves, but their message was clear. "Stop making trouble or you'll regret it." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there in the dark, the phone still in my hand, my mind racing. The intimidation had escalated from fake cops to anonymous threats. That only meant one thing: they were getting desperate. And desperation, I knew, made people reckless. But instead of fear, I felt something else: resolve. Every threat, every forged document, every attempt to scare me only confirmed I was right. The HOA was hiding something massive, and I was the one person who could bring it to light. I wasn't just dealing with nosy neighbors or overzealous board members. I was up against a corrupt system built on deception. And now that I knew their headquarters sat on my land, I had the ultimate card to play. The real battle was only beginning. The night of the threatening phone call lingered in my mind for days. Every time the phone rang, I half expected another faceless voice to hiss warnings in my ear. But instead of scaring me into silence, the call lit a fire inside me. If they thought intimidation would work, they clearly didn't know who they were dealing with. I began digging deeper, not just into property records, but into the HOA itself. I wanted to know who they really were, how they got their power, and why. They were so desperate to keep me in line. On the surface, it looked like any other neighborhood association. They collected dues, enforced petty rules about lawns and fences, and held monthly meetings in their so-called headquarters. But beneath that polished veneer, I suspected something far darker. My first stop was the county courthouse. I combed through public filings, looking for incorporation papers, tax documents, anything that could reveal how the HOA operated. What I found was puzzling. Their paperwork was inconsistent. Some documents listed them as a non-profit, others as a private management company. Addresses didn't match. Names of board members changed abruptly from year to year. It was as if they had built a house of cards and kept rearranging it to confuse anyone who looked too closely. Even stranger, there were no official permits for the construction of their office building. On record, it didn't exist. No zoning approvals, no inspections, no registered contractors. It was as if the building had materialized out of thin air. And yet, there it stood, sitting right on my land. That discovery rattled me. The HOA wasn't just corrupt. They were ghosts in the system. They had carved out power with fake documents and empty threats, operating in plain sight while leaving no legitimate trace behind. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I reached out to a trusted friend, someone I knew wouldn't run to the HOA with gossip. His name was Mark, an attorney who had helped me years ago with a minor property dispute. When I laid the documents out on his desk, he raised an eyebrow. "This is bad," he said slowly, flipping through the pages. "Very bad. For them. What you've got here is enough to dismantle their entire operation, but it also makes you a target. They'll fight like hell to keep this buried." I asked him what my options were. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. You got two. One, you take this to the authorities right now and let them handle it. Or two, you play this smart, gather more evidence, and wait until you've got them backed into a corner. The first option is safer. The second option is riskier, but if you pull it off, they won't just be fined, they'll be destroyed. I didn't need time to decide. I was going with the second option. Mark sighed, clearly expecting that answer. Then be careful, he warned. They'll come after you harder now. They know you're not like the others they've bullied into. Silence, and he was right. The harassment escalated within days. My mailbox was stuffed with anonymous letters, some full of legal jargon meant to scare me, others just crude insults scrawled in messy handwriting. My car tires were slashed one morning. At night, I heard footsteps outside my window. But when I looked, no one was there. The message was clear: back down or face consequences. But every attack only made me more determined. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every neighbor they had tricked, every family they had intimidated into paying illegal dues, every voice they had silenced. One evening, as I reviewed the documents again, something new caught my eye. In one of the earliest property maps, the office building wasn't labeled as HOA headquarters. Instead, it was listed under a private company name I didn't recognize: North Star Development Group. Curious, I dug into it further. What I uncovered was explosive. North Star had been dissolved years ago after a fraud investigation. Its executives were accused of embezzling money from community projects, but the case was quietly dropped before it went to trial. And the name of one of those executives? None other than the current HOA president. It all made sense now. The HOA wasn't just a neighborhood group, it was a front. A recycled scheme run by the same people who had once been caught stealing, now hiding behind the mask of community service. And their office, sitting on my land, was the nerve center of it all. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to march into their office and confront them. Not yet. That would be reckless. Instead, I was going to let them think I was scared. Let them think I was backing down, while all the while, I gathered the last pieces of evidence I needed. Because when I finally made my move, I wanted it to be devastating. And as I sat there in the dark, documents spread across my table, I realized something. The HOA thought they had power because of fear. But fear was no longer on their side. It was on mine. The next morning, I walked out onto my porch and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, the sky clear, but there was no peace in my neighborhood anymore. Every smile from a passerby felt forced. Every glance from a neighbor seemed tinged with fear. The HOA's shadow hung over all of us. I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to just fight back, I was going to expose them. But I needed a plan, a careful one. The first step was surveillance. If their office truly sat on my property, then I had every right to monitor it. I bought a set of discrete cameras and installed them around the perimeter of the building late one night, making sure no one saw me. Each device fed directly into a secure server I controlled. Within days, the footage began painting a damning picture. Board members came and went at odd hours. Trucks unloaded boxes through the back door. People who weren't even residents of our community shuffled in and out, carrying envelopes stuffed with cash. This wasn't just an HOA. It was a full-blown racket. The footage was gold, but it wasn't enough. I needed something that would tie everything together. A piece of evidence so undeniable that no amount of fake paperwork or legal intimidation could erase it. I thought back to the dissolved company, North Star Development Group, and the fraud case that vanished into thin air. If I could link the HOA's current activities to North Star's shady history, it would blow the entire operation wide open. So I reached out to an investigative journalist I'd once met through Mark. Her name was Claire, and she thrived on stories exactly like this. When I showed her the footage, her eyes widened. "This isn't just an HOA story," she whispered. "This is organized crime hiding in plain sight." She agreed to help, but warned me, "If they know you're working with me, they'll double down on you. And if they find out I'm involved, they'll try to ruin me too." That didn't scare me. If anything, it reassured me. Because now, I wasn't alone. Together, we began piecing the puzzle. Claire dug through old court filings and interviewed former employees of North Star. I tracked money trails, comparing the HOA's suspiciously high dues to deposits in offshore accounts. Slowly, the web of corruption began to form a clear picture. But the HOA wasn't stupid. They knew something was happening. One evening, as I was returning from Claire's office, I noticed a black SUV parked outside my house. The windows were tinted, the engine idling. When I walked closer, it sped off into the night. The next morning, a notice was nailed to my front door. "Cease and desist immediately. Final warning." Final warning. That phrase rattled me because it meant they were running out of patience. And desperate people do dangerous things. Mark, ever cautious, told me to back off. "You've got enough. Hand it over to the authorities and let them handle it before you get hurt." But I shook my head. "Not yet. If I stop now, they'll find a way to bury this. I need to trap them in a way that leaves no room for denial." That's when the idea struck me. The HOA was scheduled to hold their quarterly meeting in 2 weeks. It was always a smug display of authority, with board members handing down new rules while everyone sat quietly, too afraid to object. This time, I was going to turn their own meeting into a stage, and their downfall into a spectacle. Called Claire and told her my plan. She hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. We would gather residents, invite local officials under the pretense of a community announcement, and then, at the height of the meeting, unveil the evidence. The cameras, the financial records, the ties to North Star, everything. But I also knew the HOA wouldn't make it easy. If they caught even a whiff of what I was planning, they'd try to shut me down before the meeting ever happened. So I acted normal. I mowed my lawn. I waved politely at neighbors. When the HOA president passed by in his polished SUV, I even nodded, as if I were just another beaten-down resident. But underneath that mask, I was preparing the trap. Each night, I tested my backup, drives, ensuring the evidence was stored in multiple places. I rehearsed my speech until I could deliver it without trembling. Claire lined up her press contacts, ready to broadcast the story the moment it broke. The night before the meeting, I stood in my living room, staring at the pile of documents and hard drives on the table. My stomach churned with nerves. What? If they attacked me before I could reveal it? What if they silenced Claire? Then I remembered the faces of my neighbors, the single mother fined for having a swing set in her yard, the retired veteran harassed over his American flag, the family forced to sell their home because they couldn't afford the bogus dues. No, failure wasn't an option. This wasn't just about land anymore. It wasn't even just about corruption. It was about freedom. Tomorrow, the trap would spring, and when it did, the HOA would finally face the one thing they couldn't bully, threaten, or erase: the truth. The day of the meeting arrived like the calm before a storm. The sun shone down on our little suburban neighborhood, but there was a weight in the air that pressed down on everyone who dared to step outside. Word had spread, quietly, discreetly, that something was going to happen at the HOA meeting. People didn't know the details, but they knew enough to come. By 6 o'clock that evening, the community center parking lot was overflowing. Cars lined the street, neighbors clustered in small groups, whispering nervously. Some looked hopeful, others anxious, but all of them were curious. I arrived early, carrying nothing more than a small black case that contained my laptop and hard drives. Claire was already inside, disguised as a simple guest with a notepad in her lap. To everyone else, she looked like just another resident, but in truth, she was a loaded weapon ready to fire. The HOA board sat at the front table, smug as ever. Their president, a broad-shouldered man with a too-perfect smile, pounded the gavel. "Order! Let's begin." The meeting started like all the others. Long-winded announcements, new fees introduced without discussion, veiled threats disguised as reminders of community rules. I watched the residents squirm, shifting in their chairs, too afraid to speak up. Then the president leaned forward, his voice carrying that rehearsed authority. "And finally, we have one last matter to address. A resident has been spreading dangerous misinformation about this association. Let me be clear, these lies will not be tolerated." Every eye in the room turned to me. I stood slowly, the black case in my hand. "Funny you should bring that up," I said, my voice calm but loud enough for the room to hear. "Because tonight, I'm not here to spread lies. I'm here to share the truth." The president's smile faltered. "You're out of line. Sit down." But I didn't sit. Instead, I walked to the projector at the side of the room and set up my laptop. My heart hammered in my chest, but my hands were steady. Within seconds, the screen behind me flickered to life. The first image appeared, grainy night footage of board members unloading boxes through the back door of their office. Gasps echoed through the crowd. "This," I said, pointing at the screen, "is your board, smuggling in cash off the books into a building they don't even own." The president slammed his fist on the table. "This is doctored footage. None of this is real." But I was ready. With a single keystroke, the next slide appeared. Official property maps showing the boundaries of my land, with the HOA office squarely in the middle. Claire's research backed it up with deeds and legal documents. "This office," I declared, "is built illegally on property that belongs to me. They've been operating here without rights, without ownership, and without accountability." The C. Residents erupted into murmurs. Some shouted in disbelief. Others cursed under their breath. The board members whispered frantically among themselves, their carefully polished confidence cracking. Then I dropped the bomb. A chart appeared on the screen, a web of accounts, transactions, and connections, all traced back to North Star Development Group, the dissolved company that once faced charges of fraud. The lines tied North Star's corrupt past directly to our HOA's present-day bank accounts. Offshore transfers, shell corporations, and slush funds all glowed brightly on the screen like a spider's web. "This isn't about enforcing rules," I said, my voice rising. "This isn't about community. This is about fraud, about stealing from hardworking families under the disguise of authority. This is about organized crime hiding behind the letters HOA." The room went silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector. Then a voice from the crowd shouted, "He's right!" Another followed. "They fined me thousands. For nothing!" And another, "We've been robbed!" The room exploded into chaos. Residents stood, yelling, some charging toward the board members, others demanding refunds, answers, justice. The president banged his gavel furiously, shouting for order, but his voice was drowned by the roar of the people he had ruled over for years. Just when I thought it couldn't get more intense, the doors at the back of the hall burst open. Men in black uniforms stormed in, badges glinting under the fluorescent lights, but their movements sloppy, their demeanor off. "Fake cops, again, everyone sit down." One of them barked, holding up what looked like a badge but had the shine of a cheap replica. For a split second, fear rippled through the crowd, but then Claire stood up, pointing her phone directly at them, live streaming. "These aren't real officers," she shouted. "They're frauds, just like the board." The residents hesitated, then rallied. Dozens of phones came up, cameras recording. The so-called officers froze, realizing they weren't in control anymore. Under the blinding light of 100 lenses, their intimidation evaporated. The president's face turned red. He knew it was over. He knew the power he'd clung to so desperately had just slipped through his fingers. I leaned forward, my voice carrying through the chaos. "You've spent years threatening us, stealing from us, bullying us. But tonight it ends. The truth is out, and there's nothing you can do to hide it." For the first time, the board sat silent. Their empire was crumbling, and they knew it. The reckoning had begun. The meeting hall had transformed into a storm of noise, rage, and revelation. The board sat stunned, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. The fake officers, trapped under the piercing glare of 100 recording phones, shifted, uncomfortably, their fake authority dissolving into fear. For years, the HOA had ruled by intimidation, but that night the spell broke. The residents surged forward, not with violence, but with demands. Papers were waved, stories shouted, accusations hurled like stones. "You fined me for flowers in my yard," one woman yelled. "You tried to foreclose on my house," a man shouted. Voices overlapped, a chorus of betrayal echoing in the hall. The president pounded the table, veins bulging in his forehead. "This is out of order. None of this is admissible." But his words were drowned out by Claire's voice. She had risen to her feet, phone still in hand, streaming live to hundreds, maybe thousands online. "This is more than admissible," she said. "This is evidence, and it's already been sent to state authorities." The board members froze. "Every document," she continued, her voice steady, "every fraudulent transaction, every illegal fine, it's all backed up. Even if you shut this down now, the damage is done. Investigators are already watching." The president's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked less like a leader and more like a man cornered by his own lies. Then came the sound none of us expected: sirens, real ones. The shrill wail cut through the chaos, growing louder until red and blue lights flashed through the community center's windows. The fake cops stiffened, their bravado collapsing instantly. Residents parted as uniformed officers, real officers this time, marched inside. Their presence shifted the entire atmosphere. The noise quieted. The anger simmered into a heavy silence. The lead officer stepped forward, expression grim. He looked at the so-called officers first, their knockoff uniforms, their trembling hands still gripping. "Fake badges. You boys want to explain what you're doing here?" They stuttered, tried to spin a story, but the officer didn't wait. "Drop the props. You're under arrest for impersonating law enforcement." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the fake cops were cuffed and led away, their arrogance finally stripped bare. Then the officer turned to the board. "And as for you," he pulled a folded paper from his pocket, "we've received credible reports of fraud, embezzlement, and illegal construction. Until further notice, this association is under investigation. You're all coming with us." The room erupted, but this time it wasn't anger. It was vindication. Neighbors clapped, some cheered, others cried in relief as the board was rounded up. The president protested, shouting about legal counsel and rights, but his voice cracked. He wasn't in control anymore. As the officers led them out, I stepped forward. "Wait," I said, raising a hand. The officer paused. I pointed at the property map still glowing on the projector screen. "Before you go, they should know one last truth. This entire office, this entire operation, they built it on land that doesn't even belong to them." A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. The officer studied the maps, then looked back at me. "You're the landowner?" I nodded. "Legally and fully. They've been squatting here under the guise of authority." The officer gave a short, humorless laugh. "Well, that's going to make their case even worse." He tipped his hat slightly. "We'll be in touch." With that, the HOA board, once the tyrants of our neighborhood, were marched out in handcuffs. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift. News stations picked up the story, fueled by Claire's footage and the live stream that had gone viral. Headlines screamed about fake cops, HOA corruption, and an entire office built illegally on stolen land. The neighborhood buzzed with a new kind of energy, relief mixed with disbelief. People who once lived in fear now walked with their heads high, talking openly about the tyranny they had endured. Some even came to me, thanking me not just for fighting back, but for giving them hope. Investigators tore through the HOA's finances, unearthing years of embezzlement, kickbacks, and bribes. The board members faced charges ranging from fraud to conspiracy. Their empire of control crumbled overnight. As for the land, once the legal dust settled, the office was vacated, and the property reverted fully to me. Standing in front of the empty building one morning, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and disbelief. The place that had been used as a weapon against us was now nothing more than a shell. Claire walked up beside me, hands in her pockets. You could sell it, or rebuild. Maybe turn it into something good for the community. I smiled faintly. Maybe, but for now, I just want to enjoy the silence. She nodded, and for the first time in months, the neighborhood was quiet. No threatening letters, no fines, no fake cops, just peace. It was over. The HOA that once ruled with fear had been exposed, dismantled, and erased. All because they underestimated the power of truth and the land they built their lies upon. And as I walked home, past neighbors who waved and smiled instead of looking away, I realized something. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about property. It's about protecting what's right, even when the world tries to tell you otherwise. That night, I slept without worry for the first time in years. The reckoning was complete.